Before each of our board meetings, someone shares a reading and we light a chalice. And on Thursday, that someone was our board moderator, Greg Penner. But instead of a reading, we listened to the Beatles singing Let It Be. Greg asked us to think about something before we listened. He said, "When you find yourselves in times of trouble, who or what is your Mother Mary?" And I took that to mean, what do you find steady and calming and supportive? And as I listened to the song, I realized that for me, it is nature that does that. Trees, the ocean, any water really. Mountains, flowers, leaves, the moon or the stars or sunrise or sunset. All of these things let me lean in and whisper words of wisdom to me. And while they may not actually say, "Let it be," I will tell you that at that very regular moment in my world where something beautiful catches my attention, everything else just kind of takes a back seat for a minute. Many years ago, during one of those Facebook quizzes where you ask your children to answer questions about you, I asked my daughters, "What do I always say?" "I love you," I guess. "Good grief." "Oy vey." I don't know. "Oh, wait," yelled Marcella. "It's, oh, look at that beautiful sunset, clouds, moon, anything really. That's what you say all the time." Guilty as charged. And while I may take it a little far, I know that I'm not alone in resting in the beauty of the natural world. Millions of coffee table books, scenic calendars, and poems can't be wrong. But there are so many ways, different ways to look at nature and to relate to it. Unfortunately, Western Christianity has kind of led with the dominion over feeling. God made the world in 6 days, no less, and then created man and woman and placed them in a garden with instructions to just ignore the best tree with the juiciest apples. Oh well. But the part about how humanity had dominion over everything, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I'm grateful for more modern scriptural interpretations that encourage humanity to be caretakers of creation. A job we are definitely messing up, frankly. There are other religious traditions that encourage a more creative partnership between nature and humanity. Most indigenous cultures worked in harmony with nature. Land wasn't something that could be owned. Land just was something alive. Animals were thanked for their sacrifice so people could eat. But I believe that it's science and not religion that's bringing us some of the most interesting questions and answers today. See, we're learning through science that a lot of our westernized ideas about nature are often just plain flat out wrong. Our laws about endangered species are one of the places that we're seeing this. Historically, we've tended to look at the particular species that's in danger and tried to figure out how to protect that. But in the last few decades, we're realizing that you can't save a species without saving a habitat, and that the interactions between species and habitats have much greater effects than we've considered. For example, right here, very close to home on the coast, we've learned that you can't save the silver spot butterfly without saving the blue violets that they need to feed and nurture them through their larval stage. And that those blue violets only grow in salt spray meadows, clear meadows close enough to the ocean to actually receive the salt spray and fog, but free of trees that are too close, which keep the violets from getting enough light, but with trees close enough to protect the adult butterflies and let them breed. before laying their eggs again on the blue violets. It's an awfully specialized habitat. There are about 7 places they're found. Mount Hebo has about 80% of the population, while Cascade Head, where we went on hikes when I was a counselor at Westwind, has several too. We've also learned that messing with one species has a trophic cascade effect on other species as well, which affects the whole ecosystem. The example most of us probably know best is about the wolves in Yellowstone Park. Yellowstone Park was created in 1872, but hunting wasn't against the rules of the park at the time. The National Park Service was founded in 1916, but its enabling legislation included words that authorized the Secretary of the Interior to provide in his discretion for the destruction of such animals and of such plant life as may be detrimental to the use of said parks. And so wolves, which were seen as dangerous predators, were killed off by the U.S. Army and the Parks Administration. And by 1926, there weren't any wolves living in the park anymore. But we have learned that if you remove an apex predator from an ecosystem, that will have consequences. The elk population increased drastically. Wolves eventually became endangered outside of the park. And eventually in 1995 and 96, 14 and then 17 wolves were released into Yellowstone from other places. Scientists knew that the elk population would probably go down, but they hadn't realized everything else that would happen. Once the wolves were introduced, the elk grazed across a wider range, and the willow population that they had pretty much browsed to death grew back. Willow is the most popular food for beavers, and Yellowstone went from having just one beaver dam to having several. Beaver dams help with the water table and provide cold, deeper ponds that help fish. I read a book this week that taught me some really wonderful things about the relationships trees have with one another. Suzanne Simard, in her book Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest, has shared her scientific research about how trees relate to one another in ways that I don't think most of us had imagined. I bet many of us have seen nurse logs in a forest, a dead tree that other trees grow on. Have you seen those out on a hike? Yeah? And we know about compost, how dead vegetation and food scraps and even manure feeds plants. And so it makes sense that a seedling sprouting on a nurse log gets a nutritional boost. But Simard's work goes way beyond that. She grew up in a logging family in British Columbia, Canada, and her family harvested trees in the way that most loggers harvested trees prior to the age of mechanization. They climbed up past the thickest part of the trunk. They hammered steel plates into the trunk, and then they stood on those. And then with a friend, they'd cut into the tree with a cross-cut manual saw. It could take a whole day of heavy sawing to fell a big tree. And they'd cut a wedge shape into it, and then they'd hammer an iron wedge into the back with a sledgehammer, hoping that the tree would fall where they were expecting it to. And from then, the men, and it was almost always men back then, would cut off the branches and either slide it down the chute to the river, where they'd make a raft of logs and float the logs that way, or they'd pull it out with horses and chains. Logging has changed, though it's still one of the most dangerous occupations. Suzanne Simard began doing seasonal work for a logging company in British Columbia when she was 20 years old, about 1980, and very few women at the time were working in forestry. Her own childhood experiences had told her that there had to be a better way than either clear-cutting or killing off all the competing trees, but that was the orthodoxy at the time. Trees had to be replanted. But if what you were trying to raise was Douglas fir, you didn't want any other trees shading the Douglas fir seedlings. so the birch or other species needed to be thinned. Stanard somehow knew that this was wrong. She could see that Doug fir growing in areas where other trees were killed with herbicides like Roundup, or even just chopped down, grew a little faster initially, but didn't stay as healthy. She writes, "There were many ways to improve. Sow more locally adapted seed in the nursery, grow bigger seedlings, prepare the ground more meticulously, plant sooner after logging, remove competing brush." She said, "But the clues told me that the answer lay in the soil and how the seedling's roots connected in it. I sketched a robust seedling with branched roots and running fungi, and a sickly one with a minuscule shoot and stunted roots." I'm going to take a moment here and show you some pictures of forests. The first 9 or so photos are from the redwoods in Northern California. Stanard writes of her experiences conducting studies in the forest. She writes of almost poisoning herself, not realizing she was supposed to put filters in the masks she and her sister wore to apply Roundup to various patches of the forest, and of wanting her data to prove her point without having to fight for her conclusions, something she eventually realized she'd have to do. And she writes of her amazing conclusions that trees communicate with one another through vast, complex, mycorrhizal or fungal networks. Far from competing for sunlight and space, which is the conventional wisdom, the Douglas firs and the birch trees actually are connected by these mycorrhizal networks growing underground, trading carbon and sugars under the dirt, making each tree healthier and more likely to survive. One of her experiments consisted of putting metal or plastic barriers around each individual tree so the networks can't form, and those trees didn't do nearly as well. This information wasn't particularly well received by many of the traditional forest folks she worked with. They were paid to get trees to market as quickly as possible, and conventional wisdom said that trees were a crop and that monocrops are easiest to harvest and manage. It makes some intuitive sense that if each tree has enough room to grow straight and tall with no competition, that those trees will get to market faster. But Stanard also went back to indigenous knowledge. A Washington Post review notes, "A light bulb went on when she heard Bruce Sibiye Miller of the Skokomish Nation describe the forest as a symbiotic organism. Under the forest floor, Miller taught, there is an intricate and vast system of roots and fungi that keeps the forest strong." This intuitively made sense to Stanard. She traced the underground fungal connections and quantified indigenous knowledge using the methods and language of Western science. She remembered that the three sisters, corn and beans and squash, were planted together rather than separately. And she tried this in her own garden, where she realized that, of course, the corn provided a natural structure for the beans to climb and thrive, and squash spread out low, maximizing the food grown in a given space. But then she pulled up the roots and noticed that these too formed mycorrhizal networks. We now know what indigenous people knew from experience, that these networks are crucial to the life and support of plants. In fact, mycorrhizas are present in 92% of plant families studied. We have no idea what's going on under the earth. As Kate Brown, the MIT scientist, not our governor, writes in her review of the mother tree for the Washington Post, trees share. Fast-growing birch send nutrients to slower-moving fir trees. In the winter, the goods go in reverse. Birch, which are now shorn of their leaves, receive sugars and carbons from evergreens. Mother trees shoot life-giving nutrients in underground networks of mycorrhizal fungi to saplings circling their crowns. And trees share more than food. They send messages, warnings, and defensive chemicals to their neighbors. They form mutual aid societies across species. But they don't collaborate indiscriminately. Mother trees recognize their own offspring. A tree standing alone in full sun in a clear-cut forest is not a triumphant conqueror commanding all resources, but a solitary individual vulnerable to blight and drought. Samar discovered that the old trees nurture the young ones and provide them food and water just as we do to our own children. It is enough to make one pause, take a deep breath, and contemplate the social nature of the forest and how this is critical for evolution. The fungal network appears to wire the trees for fitness. And more, these old trees are mothering their children. One of my favorite things to ponder is, what do we have no idea we don't know? I think about what we were certain of 500 years ago that we've now proven absolutely wrong. Not what we couldn't imagine, like airplanes or iPhones or computers, or even electricity, but what we're actually wrong about. Germ theory comes to mind, or the idea of washing your hands between patients. 500 years from now, which ones of our firmly held beliefs will be proven false? Not having a time machine, I only have guesses. But here are a couple of mine. I think 500 years from now, our ideas that there are only two irrefutable genders will seem quaint. I think we'll see gender on more of a spectrum. And I firmly believe that future generations will shake their heads at our ideas that humans were the only species that communicate. I'm cheating a little bit on both of these. These are not my original ideas, obviously. But I'd love to see what we learn about other species and animals and plants. Of course, in 500 years, the ants may have taken over. Enjoy nature, my friends. Revel in its beauty and its mystery. But be careful. It may end up outsmarting all of us. So let's approach things humbly. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen.